isn't this already in the legislation? It sounds like a no-brainer, surely.
You're right. It is a no-brainer. It was a no-brainer before the terrible events and the fallout from Sarah Everard's awful murder, but it certainly is a no-brainer now. And the reality is we have the legislation before us in the Lords that's coming down the track in a couple of weeks has a very good part in it, and it's about prevention. It's about serious prevention of serious violence, and there's a duty in there, not just on police forces, I might add. There's a duty on health authorities, there's a duty on education partners, there's a duty on probation services to come together and to put together a serious violence prevention strategy. The problem we have, though, is that the definition of serious violence for the purposes of that duty does not include sexual violence, domestic abuse, or domestic homicide. And that is just not acceptable. And it's it would be a hugely missed opportunity if the government doesn't change this.
What have ministers said to you when you've talked to them about it? What excuse have they given for this omission?
Well, I mean, the excuse, which, by the way, on paper sounds perfectly reasonable, is they want that local leaders to decide for themselves what the strategy should be based on their particular crime profile. But look, the problem with that is, I'm afraid, we don't have the luxury of localism on this issue. And in my view, localism was about where you build houses, which new schools are set up. It's not about whether or not you can sort of opt out of preventing domestic abuse and sexual violence. And in any case, there is absolutely no per head variation really across the country when it comes to sexual violence and domestic abuse. It's not like gun crime or knife crime, where, of course, there is a sort of particular crime profile. So I cannot see any reason why a local authority shouldn't be including these crimes in it. And indeed, the patchiness that we have seen geographically already on this issue is a very good reason why it absolutely should be ruled out.
So you think at the moment that the police don't take these crimes seriously and really need to be forced to by legislation?
Well, I think that, look, it's very important. There's a lot of nuance in this. There are certain police forces and absolutely a lot of police officers who are showing huge dedication and excellence in this area. But it's certainly true that not just police forces, this is about bringing together lots of different authorities to actually try and prevent the crime from happening in the first place. This can't be all laid at the police's door. I mean, for example, only 1 in 4 victims of domestic abuse will ever get to see the police. Okay, so there's a lot more going on with society that needs to be addressed, which is why this duty is basically, in essence, a good thing. But it's certainly true that the policing approach does not have that sort of national coordination that, let's say, a crime like terrorism does.
And does your amendment stand a chance? Are you hoping that ministers might accept it before it gets to a vote, or do you think you're going to end up having to be a rebel?
Look, I hope they will listen. They listened during the Domestic Abuse Act, the passage of that bill. They listened a great deal. They took on board many, many amendments. They listened to frontline workers and indeed to peers like myself. So I'm hopeful they will listen. And I think that, it would be most odd if they make so many announcements as they have been doing, and I take them absolutely at face value. I believe wholeheartedly that Boris Johnson wants to change these situations, that the Home Secretary is committed to it. That on the one hand, to make those kind of announcements and then not to do this, I think would be odd and quite schizophrenic.
Is this a personal priority for you? What's driving you to work on this in such great detail?
Well, it is quite personal. Tragically, I lost my cousin to murder. And do you know what? I think it was over 30 years ago. And there's not a day that goes by that I don't think of her. And if we could prevent any family from ever having to go through anything like our family went through, then it's got to be worth it, because it is just the most, I can't even put it into words.
It must have been very hard for you following the Sarah Everard case and seeing the victim impact statements from her family then.
Yes, well, I think that the impact statement that Sarah Everard's sister and mother made were just so powerful and so important, because, of course, people think about the impact that a murder like that has on the family, but just having it laid bare. And I urge anyone who cares at all about this subject, they must read those statements. It was a harrowing read, but so important.
They are very harrowing indeed. And the other thing that has obviously really unsettled a lot of women is the fact that Wayne Couzens used his status as a police officer to trap Sarah Everard. Do you think the police have responded well to the revelations that were made during his sentencing hearing and during the investigation?
Well, no, I think the initial response was not great at all. And again, it's always sort of the impetus is so often still placed on the woman, flag down a bus. Of course, that's not appropriate. And I think the other thing I would say is that we have to keep looking at the perpetrators, the people who are committing these crimes. And all too often, the response on why didn't she leave the relationship? Why did she sort of walk alone at night? And that just isn't good enough. And we have to change the sort of way we look at these crimes. And the other thing I would say, Isabel, that just in the context of my own experience and obviously Wayne Couzens, the idea that sort of flashing and sort of being generally a sort of sex pest is a sort of low-grade crime absolutely cannot continue. These are not low-grade crimes. Anyone who is flashing or revealing themselves, this is behaviour where the boundaries are completely and utterly gone. And I think enough is enough on that front, and all these crimes absolutely be taken far more seriously.
Do you think Boris Johnson should have blocked the harassment law that Priti Patel has been pushing for? There's also the amendment coming up in the Lords in the next few weeks on misogyny as a hate crime, and the Prime Minister's been clear that he doesn't think that's needed. So what's he up to here? If he says he's serious about these matters, why is he blocking this?
Well, look, I think that as Prime Minister, you have to make very tough decisions, and you can't just sort of, in the sort of big pressure of public opinion, you can't say yes to absolutely everything if you actually feel that it's perhaps not the right approach, or that, as unpopular as that may be. I think on misogyny, look, I'm absolutely for the police recording misogyny as a hate crime. I think we absolutely need to get much more data on these sorts of crimes. So I'm pro that. I'm also pro courts taking into account sentencing, misogyny when they're sentencing crimes. What I'm less pro, and where I have a degree of sympathy with the Prime Minister, is rushing laws and making sure that laws introduced are actually workable. And so we do. I am. Like I said, in principle, I'm for it, but I think it does have to be taken, not rushed, put it that way.
Do you think violence against women and girls is treated as seriously by the police and the government as terrorism, for instance?
No, I don't. And I think that has to change. I think for too long it's been sort of, taken as a bit of an inevitability of life. Since Sarah Everard's death, there have been 80 women have been killed. That's huge, far more than who have died via terrorism. And yet, for some reason, there is a big national response. There's huge prestige, probably, about being in the terror units of the Met Police, probably far more prestige than there would be in the sort of sexual violence unit. And I think that absolutely has to change. There needs to be far more funding for this area of crime. There needs to be much more prestige and much more prioritisation and much more national coordination in the way that has worked very well with crimes like terror, child abuse, and also county lines. So it's very possible to do, and it's possible to get right.
And what about the culture, not just actually within the police, but also within Parliament? There's still a bit of a locker room mentality in both of those worlds, isn't there?
I think it's. I actually haven't experienced locker room mentality in Parliament. I've got to be honest with you. I've been very lucky. I know others have. I myself very nearly joined the police when I left university, and I didn't for two reasons. The first was because, if I'm completely honest with myself, I probably wasn't brave enough. I think we have to acknowledge that most people who join the police are very brave, very dedicated, and they put their lives on the line for us. But the second reason was that sort of locker room, that idea that you sort of had to be one of the boys. Whether that's right or wrong, I don't know. But obviously, following all the revelations from Wayne Couzens, it would seem that was right. And it's very saddening that was over 25 years ago. But I think that many women in my position, young women who are in that position now, may take that same decision. And I think the police really, really have to look at themselves and not be defensive over this. They have to try and change that culture because otherwise things will just not, not much can change.
Morning, Gabby. It's Tom.
Hi, Tom.
Now, not to try and repeatedly suggest you need to rebel against the government and irritate them every single corner, because I know you're not that kind of person. Your Tory colleague, Baroness Stroud, is amending another bill going through the Lords quite soon, the uprating bill, to try and force the government to reimpose that £20 a week in universal credit, that extra £20 a week that was taken away last week alone. You'll have a vote on that. Have you decided what you're going to do?
So I'll have to look at it carefully, but look, firstly, Philippa Stroud, Baroness Stroud, is such an incredible campaigner on this issue, and I think anything she has to say on it does need to be listened to. I do have sympathy with the government in that the pandemic measures cannot sort of be put in place forever, and having been on the other side and seen how difficult it is to manage public finances, I obviously understand that they have tough choices. But equally, though, the safety net that we have to put in place for vulnerable people, and particularly the point she makes about people with disability and people with children who have disabilities, I think that safety net has to be looked at the whole time. So I will certainly be taking this very seriously and may well vote with her.
You may well.
I may well, yes.